She was 58 years old, alone in the mountains, and a powerful man wanted her gone. But she refused to move. For 12 years, Margaret Holloway held on to a ranch that everyone said she should abandon. The land was too hard, the winters too brutal. She was too old, and now a wealthy investor with lawyers, money, and patience had set his sights on her property, convinced that loneliness would do what the cold never could. What he didn't count on was a former wilderness guide who stopped one frozen morning when everyone else kept walking, and what neither of them expected was what that single moment would cost them both. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The axe came down wrong. Margaret felt it the second the blade connected. That sickening angle that told her the wood wasn't going to split. It was just going to absorb the blow like a fist into mud. The log shifted sideways off the chopping block and dropped into the snow with a dull thud, and she stood there breathing hard, watching her own breath dissolve into the gray morning air. 37 logs left in the pile, maybe more. She'd stopped counting around noon. The sky above the Wind River Range had turned the particular shade of yellow-green that old-timers called a liar's sky. Pretty to look at, murderous in intent. She had maybe 4 hours before the storm hit. Probably less. The temperature had already dropped 12 degrees since breakfast, and the wind coming down off the ridge had that particular bite that didn't just chill you, it found the places where you were already tired and worked its way in. She picked up the log, set it back on the block, and swung again. This time the axe stuck halfway through, wedged in the grain. She yanked at the handle. The log came up with it, dangling. She shook it loose, reset, and swung again, and finally the thing split. Two ragged halves that went opposite directions, neither of them anywhere near the stack she was building against the barn wall. Margaret Holloway was 58 years old, and she had been doing this, all of it, every piece of it, for 12 years without a single person who gave a damn whether she managed or didn't. She wasn't bitter about it. That was the thing people misread about her. They saw the lines around her mouth, the way she held her jaw, the fact that she rarely wasted words, and they decided she was hardened, worn down. Some of them called her difficult. The ones who thought they were being kind called her stoic. None of them were right. Margaret had learned early in her widowhood that grief was not something you processed and moved past. It was something you carried, and you either learned to carry it without letting it show, or you buckled under it while everyone watched. She had chosen not to buckle. That wasn't hardness. That was just survival. The ranch, 412 acres running from the base of the foothills up into the lower ridgeline, had been in Thomas's family before it was in hers, and that distinction had mattered to him in a way that took her years to fully understand. Thomas Holloway had not been a sentimental man by nature. He fixed fences the same way he did everything else, methodically, without complaint, without requiring acknowledgement. But the one time she had jokingly suggested, maybe 10 years into their marriage, that they might consider selling and moving somewhere with a shorter winter, he had looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before or since. Not anger. Something more complicated than that. "This land is the only honest thing I've ever owned," he said. And then he went back to eating his supper and never mentioned it again. She'd thought about those words every winter since he died. The first time she saw Caleb Dawson, he was standing at the junction of the county road and her property line, reading the old wooden sign she'd put up 8 years ago that said, simply, Holloway, private. He was looking at it the way people sometimes looked at things that reminded them of something else, thoughtful and a little far away. Like the sign was a door, and he was deciding whether to knock. She watched him from the porch for a minute, then went inside and didn't think much more about it. A week later, he was back. This time he wasn't at the road. He was at her fence line, not crossing it, just standing there looking out over the lower pasture toward the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge. He was tall, somewhere in his mid to late 30s, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than intention. His jacket was worn at the elbows. He wasn't looking at her land the way developers looked at it, calculating, acquisitive. He was looking at it the way people looked at things they found quietly beautiful. She went out to the porch again. "You planning on buying that fence with your eyes?" she called. He turned around. "No, ma'am, just looking." "At what?" He was quiet for a moment. "The way the light hits the ridge in the morning. Used to guide trips through country like this. Haven't been back in a while. What brought you back? He thought about that for a second longer than she expected. I needed somewhere that didn't ask me a lot of questions. Margaret had understood that answer better than she would have liked to admit. She went back inside and let him be. It was 2 mornings after that first woodpile struggle, with the storm still building behind the mountains, that he stopped. She hadn't noticed him come up the road. She'd been too focused on the work, the repetitive grinding effort of it, the way her right shoulder had been aching since October, the way the old axe head was starting to work loose from the handle again, and she'd been meaning to re-wedge it for 3 weeks. The woodpile was a disaster. She'd gotten through maybe a third of what she needed before her rhythm broke down entirely. That axe head's loose. She startled, spun around. Caleb Dawson was standing at the edge of her yard, hat in hand, no particular expression on his face. He wasn't smiling in that careful way people smiled when they were about to offer to help, and wanted to make it seem less like pity. I know it's loose, she said. You want me to take a look at it? I want to finish this woodpile before that storm closes the valley, which means I'd appreciate it if you moved along. He didn't move. He looked at the sky, then at the pile, then at her. Not in a judgmental way, just a reading way, like he was adding something up. You've got maybe 3 hours, he said. 4 if the storm stalls on the far ridge, which it won't. That pile's about 2 cords short of what you need. I'm aware of that too. I've split wood before. She looked at him. Is that supposed to impress me? No, it's supposed to be useful. There it was. That distinction. She'd been offered help before, plenty of times, by people from town who showed up with the specific, exhausting energy of people who needed to feel generous. The help always came wrapped in something. A look. A tone. An implication that she ought to be grateful, that she'd been struggling too long, that maybe it was time to reconsider her situation. This man wasn't doing any of that. He was just standing in her yard with his hat in his hand, telling her he'd split wood before. I've handled this ranch for 12 years, she said. I don't need anyone feeling sorry for me. Caleb looked at the cracked axe, the shrinking pile, the yellow-green sky. I'm not here because you can't do it, he said. I'm here because nobody should have to do everything alone. Margaret held his gaze for a long moment. She was looking for the catch. She always looked for the catch because in her experience there was always one. People didn't do things for nothing. They did things because they wanted something back. Your gratitude, your company, your approval, your land. And the only real question was how long it took them to get around to asking. But Caleb Dawson was just standing there, patient and without agenda. And the storm was building behind the ridge, and her shoulder was screaming, and she had 37 logs left and a loose axe head and exactly nobody else in her life who was going to show up. She held out the axe. He took it without ceremony, turned to the chopping block, tested the weight of the handle, then reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small wooden wedge and a flat stone. He worked the wedge into the joint between the handle and the head, tapped it tight with the stone, tested it again. You had this in your pocket? She said. I carry things that are useful. He set a log on the block. You stack, if you want. Or you can go in and get warm. I'll stack, she said. They worked for 2.5 hours without much conversation. The wind picked up steadily. She stacked the split wood against the barn wall in overlapping rows, and he worked the chopping block with a methodical rhythm that was neither fast nor slow, but just consistent, the kind of pace that didn't burn out. He didn't try to make conversation. He didn't explain himself. He just worked. When the first real snowflakes started coming down, fat, mean flakes that stuck instead of floating, the pile was done. Margaret stood back and looked at it. Thank you, she said. The words felt strange. She hadn't said them to another person and meant them in a long time. All right, Caleb said. He pulled on his jacket, picked up his hat. You can come in for coffee, she said, if you want. He looked at her. You sure? No, she said honestly. But I'm asking anyway. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but something close to it, something that started at the corner of his mouth and didn't go further. Then I'll come in. Eat. The coffee was strong and not particularly good, which was how she'd always made it and wasn't going to change. She set 2 mugs on the kitchen table, the kind of heavy ceramic mugs that had hung on a rack above the stove since before she'd moved in. Thomas had bought them at a flea market in Riverton. She'd never been able to get rid of them. Caleb sat down without being invited to, which she found she didn't mind. "Where are you staying?" she asked. "I rented the old Peterson place, down the valley road." She knew it. A 2-room cabin that had been empty for several years, drafty as a broken window, with a wood stove that worked when it felt like it. "That place is half a ruin. I've stayed in worse." "What did you do before?" she asked. "Guide work, you said." "Wilderness guide. Took groups into the backcountry. Wyoming, Montana, a stretch in Alaska." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "Stopped about 2 years ago." She waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't. "What happened?" she asked. He looked at the table. "Lost someone on a trip. It wasn't my fault the way the investigation went, but it was my responsibility. That's different." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She understood the weight of that. The particular way responsibility and grief intertwined, how they didn't cancel each other out but instead settled into you at the same time, like 2 stones dropped into the same water. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. "I needed to go somewhere and be still for a while." She looked around her kitchen, the worn floor, the window with the cracked caulking she'd been meaning to replace since August, the photograph of Thomas on the shelf by the stove that she'd stopped seeing years ago because she looked at it every day. "This is a good place for still," she said. "Yeah." He looked out the window at the snow coming down in earnest now, the yard disappearing under white. "I can see that." He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask permission. He just showed up and found whatever needed doing and did it. The first week, he replaced the rotted post at the corner of the lower pasture fence. The second week, he worked on the barn roof, 2 sections of which had been bowing under snowpack since the previous winter. He sourced the lumber himself, brought it in his truck, didn't ask to be reimbursed. Margaret watched this with a suspicion she couldn't quite justify. She wasn't afraid of him. Her instincts about people were generally reliable, and nothing about Caleb Dawson registered as dangerous. He was honest in a way she could recognize because she'd only ever really respected people who were. People who told you a hard thing plainly, rather than dressing it up or walking around it. But she'd learned, in the years since Thomas died, that kindness with no visible motive was the most confusing thing in the world. The people who wanted something from her, Grant Whitaker and his crew, the county officials with their assessments and suggestions, the well-meaning neighbors who implied she was a problem they were waiting to have solved, those she understood. Their interest was legible. It had shape. Caleb's interest didn't have shape, at least not one she could see yet. It was her neighbor Pete Gruber who said it first, with the particular bluntness of a man who had spent 60 years on a cattle operation and had long since given up on any social coding. He came by one Tuesday when Caleb was restringing the fence along the north field and Margaret was working the near pasture. "That your hired man?" Pete asked, nodding toward Caleb. "No." "Then what is he?" "He's helping." Pete squinted in Caleb's direction. "Man his age helping a woman your age out of the goodness of his heart. That's what that is." "Pete, I'm just saying what people are going to say." "I know what people are going to say," Margaret said, without looking up from the fencing pliers. "I don't have a lot of energy for caring." Pete made a sound that was either agreement or skepticism. She couldn't tell which. "You be careful, Margaret. People like to make stories out of things." "People like to make stories out of everything. That's not new. Just watch yourself." She turned to look at him then. "I've been watching myself for 12 years, Pete. I'm not entirely without practice." He had the decency to look a little abashed. He tipped his hat and left. What she hadn't told Pete, what she hadn't told anyone, because there was no one to tell, was that she'd started to look forward to the mornings. Not in a way she could have easily explained, not romantically, not in the embarrassing way that the women in town would have assumed and giggled about. It was simpler and stranger than that. It was the way you could look forward to something functional, like the way you looked forward to a good tool that fit right in your hand, or a reliable piece of equipment that did what it was supposed to do without requiring a lot of coaxing. She looked forward to having someone on the property who treated the work like it was worth doing. who didn't require management, didn't need praise, didn't need to be thanked in any particular way. Who showed up? That was the whole of it. After 12 years of no one showing up, the basic fact of it, of him being there, in the yard, in the barn, along the fence line, was something she hadn't expected to feel as much as she did. She didn't examine it too closely. She'd learned that examining things too closely was a good way to ruin them. Quote, Grant Whitaker came on a Thursday in a truck that cost more than most people in the valley made in 2 years. He came alone, which was unusual. Normally he brought one of his lawyers, or at least his assistant, a thin, nervous young man who took notes on everything. Today, it was just Grant, in a heavy wool coat and boots that had never seen mud. Margaret was in the yard. Caleb was around the back of the barn, out of sight. Grant stepped out of the truck with the particular ease of a man who had never in his life approached a conversation believing the other person had the advantage. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with a wide face and small, calculating eyes that he'd learned over the years to arrange into something that looked like warmth. "Margaret," he said pleasantly. "Grant," she said, "you're looking well." He looked around the yard with that proprietary glance she'd recognized the first time he came out here 3 years ago, like he was looking at something that was already his and just hadn't completed the paperwork. Getting ready for winter. Always. "I wanted to come out personally," he said. "I've got an updated offer. I think you'll find it's more than fair." "I found all your offers more than fair," she said. "That's not the problem." Something shifted fractionally in his face. "What is the problem, then? Because I have to be honest with you, Margaret, this land is going to get harder to maintain every year. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to help you see the reality." She looked at him for a long moment. "The reality is that I'm standing on my property, talking to a man who's been trying to take it from me for 3 years. That's the reality I'm working with. I'm offering to buy it. That's not taking. At a price you set for reasons you haven't made fully clear, at a time that happens to be after 2 winters that were harder than usual." She tilted her head. "You want to tell me that's all coincidence?" The warmth in his face cooled slightly. He hadn't expected that from her. He never did. "I'll leave the paperwork," he said. "Look it over." "I won't be looking it over." He held her gaze for one more second, then he smiled. A different kind of smile than before, the kind that had teeth in it, and he got back in his truck. He didn't leave the paperwork. Caleb came around the side of the barn about 2 minutes after the truck disappeared down the road. He'd been there. She suspected he'd heard most of it. "That was Whitaker?" he said. "That was Whitaker." Caleb looked down the road where the truck had gone. "He's going to come back. He always does. You want to tell me what he actually wants with this land?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ridge, at the way the afternoon light was changing on the snow up there, turning it from white to the pale gold. It went just before dusk. "I've been trying to figure that out for 3 years," she said. "Whatever it is, it's worth more to him than what he's offering me." She picked up her gloves from the porch railing, "Which means it's worth more than I know, which means I'm not selling." Caleb was quiet. "Smart," he said finally. She put her gloves on. "I have my moments." They went back to work. Outside, the light kept changing on the ridge, the way it always did, the way it had for as long as anyone had been alive to see it, and the ranch held its ground the way it always had, worn and real and stubbornly, unapologetically present. The snow that had come with the first storm didn't leave. That was the thing about winters in this part of Wyoming that people who hadn't lived through one never quite understood. They thought of snow as something that arrived and then eventually went away, a temporary condition, manageable and finite. But the snow that settled into the Wind River Valley in early November had no intention of going anywhere. It packed down, crusted over, got buried under the next layer, and the layer after that, until the ground itself became a kind of memory. Everything that had happened before November compressed into white and frozen silence underneath your boots. Margaret had lived through 23 winters here. She stopped being surprised by them around year 4. What she hadn't stopped being surprised by was how much harder each one felt when you were doing it alone. Not harder in terms of the work. She knew the work, knew it the way she knew her own hands, knew which fences needed checking first after a blow, and which section of the barn roof collected ice and how to read the creek level to know whether the east pasture was going to flood come March. The work wasn't the hard part. The hard part was the silence. The way a bad storm could pin you inside for 3 days with nothing but the wind and your own thoughts. And by the end of the third day, you'd talk to the cat and the 2 remaining horses and still felt like you hadn't said anything to anyone at all. Caleb changed that, and she was still figuring out how she felt about it. He'd fallen into a pattern without either of them designing one. Mornings, he came by around 7:30, sometimes earlier if there was something that needed doing before light. He'd figured out on his own, she hadn't told him, that she took her coffee at the kitchen table for about 20 minutes before she was fully ready to talk, and he'd learned to take his on the porch steps with the horses in the near pasture, just being outside, not requiring anything from her. When she came out, they'd talk through what needed doing that day. Then they'd do it. It was the most functional arrangement she'd had with another human being in over a decade, and that was either a testament to how easy Caleb was to be around or a fairly damning comment on the state of her social life. She suspected it was both. The town had opinions about it. This was not surprising because the town had opinions about everything, and the smaller the actual event, the larger the opinion it generated. The fact of a man showing up regularly at Margaret Holloway's property was, by the standards of Ridgeline and the surrounding valley, roughly equivalent to a civic incident. She first heard it directly from Darlene Marsh, who ran the feed store and had been one of Thomas's closer friends, and therefore believed herself entitled to a certain candor with Margaret that most people had the sense to avoid. Darlene caught her on a Thursday when Margaret came in for grain and a new pair of work gloves. The store was empty except for the 2 of them and Darlene's ancient dog sleeping under the counter, which meant there was nothing to slow Darlene down. "People are talking," Darlene said, not even pretending to be working. She just stood at the counter with her arms crossed and watched Margaret pull grain bags from the shelf. "People always talk," Margaret said, "about you and that man you've got working the place." "He's not working for me. He's helping." Margaret, Darlene's voice shifted, dropped the conversational note and went to the thing underneath it. "Some of them are saying unkind things. You should know that." Margaret set the grain bag down and turned around. "What kind of things?" "That you're not thinking straight, that you're—" Darlene stopped. "That you're letting someone take advantage of you because you've been alone too long and don't know the difference anymore." The store was very quiet. The dog snored under the counter. "Who's saying that?" Margaret asked. "Does it matter?" "It might, if it's coming from someone with a reason to want people questioning my judgment." Darlene was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Margaret saw her connect the same dot she'd already connected. Grant Whitaker had friends in town. He'd been cultivating them for years, the same way he cultivated everything, slowly, at a distance, making it look like something other than what it was. "Just be careful," Darlene said finally. "You're the 3rd person to say that to me this month," Margaret said. She picked up the grain bag. "You want to know what careful looks like? 12 years of doing everything by myself and not asking anyone for a thing. Maybe careful's gotten me about as far as it's going to get me." She put the bag in the truck and drove home. She didn't tell Caleb about that conversation. She didn't tell him about Pete Gruber's comments or the 2 women from the church auxiliary who'd stopped her after the hardware store visit to express concern in that particularly infuriating way, voices lowered, hands on her arm, that managed to be both performative and condescending at the same time. She didn't tell him because she'd spent 12 years not loading her problems onto other people and wasn't about to start now, and also because she genuinely wasn't sure how to have that conversation without it changing something between them that she didn't want changed. What she did instead was watch him more carefully. She told herself this was just sense. She'd always been observant, always assessed people slowly and without announcing she was doing it. But she knew the truth was more uncomfortable than that. She was looking for the thing he wanted. She was waiting for it to appear, the way it always appeared eventually, the real shape of a person's interest. She watched him work. She watched the way he was with the horses, but calm and direct, no excessive handling, no sweetness that wasn't earned. She watched the way he was with the occasional problems that came up. The water line that froze in early December, the section of fencing the elk had demolished overnight, the barn cat that had appeared from nowhere and stationed herself in the hayloft and refused to leave. He solved things methodically, without needing her to see him solving them, without requiring her to notice or comment. She watched the way he talked. Caleb wasn't a talker by nature, and she'd come to appreciate that. The way a conversation with him had weight because it wasn't padded with noise. He said things when he had things to say. He listened when she was speaking in a way that meant he was actually tracking what she was saying, not just waiting for his turn. One afternoon in early December, sitting on the porch in that brief window of actual warmth the winter afternoon sometimes offered, he said, out of nowhere, "You never talk about your husband." Margaret kept her eyes on the ridge. "No. You don't have to," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you doing?" He thought about that. "I guess I'm saying I've noticed, that's all." She was quiet for a while. The light on the snow up the ridge was doing the thing it did at that hour, going amber and then almost orange, like the mountain was heated from inside. "His name was Thomas," she said. "He died 11 years ago, not 12. I keep saying 12 because 11 feels too recent and 12 feels like a proper distance." She paused. "That probably doesn't make sense." "It makes sense. He was a good man. Not a perfect one. He could be stubborn in ways that made me want to throw things, and he had no patience for sentiment of any kind, which was sometimes a problem." A breath. "But he was honest. He never told me something was true when it wasn't, even when the truth was inconvenient. That's rarer than people admit." Caleb said nothing. He was listening. "I miss that most," she said. "The honesty. The way you could take what he said at face value and not spend energy looking for what was underneath it." She felt him look at her sideways. She kept her eyes on the ridge. "Is that what you do with me?" he asked. "Look for what's underneath." "Yes," she said. He nodded, like that was a fair answer, like he'd expected it. And I haven't found anything yet." She finally turned to look at him. "I don't know if that means there's nothing there, or if you're just better at hiding things than most." He met her gaze. He didn't look defensive or hurt, which was what most people looked when you said something like that to them. He just looked steady. "What would it take to convince you?" "Time," she said. "That's always the only thing." He nodded. "All right," he said, and went back to watching the ridge. The rest of December moved the way Wyoming Decembers moved, fast and merciless and indifferent to planning. 2 more storms came through, neither as bad as the first, but both adding to the existing snowpack until the valley was running out of places to put it. The creek along the east pasture was frozen solid. The horses were spending more time in the barn than out, which meant more mucking, more feed, more of everything. Margaret had calculated her hay stores in October, and they were going to be tight by February. She mentioned this to Caleb on a Tuesday morning, plainly, the way she mentioned practical problems. "I'm going to be short on hay if we get one more hard storm before March." He didn't do the thing she was half waiting for him to do, which was to treat it as an opportunity to insert himself in a bigger way, to offer money or solutions that would shift the balance of what she owed him. He just said, "Randall Birch up the North Road usually has a surplus this time of year. He sells direct. Want me to go up and talk to him?" "I can go talk to him myself." "I know you can. I'm offering to save you the drive." She thought about it. "Take the truck," she said. "Tell him Margaret Holloway's asking and see what price he gives you." Randall Birch, as it turned out, gave a fair price, and Caleb came back with both the deal and a load of hay in the truck bed, which he'd apparently arranged on the spot because he'd had the sense to bring cash. She hadn't asked him to do that. He'd just understood that if the answer was yes, there was no point in making 2 trips. That was the thing about him that she kept circling back to, the thing she couldn't quite categorize. He was useful in the specific way that meant he understood situations without needing them explained in full. Not in a presumptuous way. He didn't overstep, didn't make decisions that weren't his to make. But he understood context. He filled in gaps without being asked to. Thomas had been like that. She hadn't known, until Thomas died, how rare it was. Well, it was Pete Gruber who first mentioned Grant Whitaker's name again, and not in a casual way. Pete came by in the second week of December, ostensibly to return a post hole digger he'd borrowed in August and clearly forgotten about, But Margaret had known Pete for 15 years and knew he didn't make trips without more than one reason. He handed over the post-hole digger, looked around the yard for Caleb, who wasn't there that morning, having gone into town for lumber, and then said without particular preamble, "Whitaker's been talking to the county." Margaret set down what she was holding. "What about?" "Road access easements, specifically the old logging track that runs along the south end of your property." Pete's expression was uncomfortable. He didn't like delivering information he knew was going to land badly. Word is, he's trying to establish a historical use claim on it. If he gets it, he'd have legal access across your land. She felt the cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "That road hasn't been used in 20 years, she said. "I know that. You know that. His lawyers are arguing the records don't show a formal closure." Pete looked at her steadily. "Margaret, I don't know what this man's play is, but he's not just trying to buy your land. He's trying to get around you." She stood very still for a moment, the wind moving through the yard with that particular low moan it had when it came off the east ridge, the sound she'd been hearing for 23 winters and had never quite gotten used to. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "You need a lawyer." "I know I need a lawyer." "You got one?" "Not yet." She picked up what she'd been holding. "I will." Pete nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more, like he wanted to apologize for some of what he'd said before, the comments about her judgment, the concern that wasn't quite concern. He didn't say it, because Pete wasn't built for apologies any more than she was, but she could see it in his face, and she accepted it the way she accepted most things, without making it into more than it was. Well, she told Caleb when he got back that afternoon. She told him the way she told him most things, directly, without prelude, laying out the facts and leaving the shape of the problem visible without decorating it. He listened. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking rather than stalling. "Does he actually have a claim?" Caleb asked. "I don't know. Thomas always said the logging track was private, but I don't know what's in the formal record." "Where are your property documents?" "In the house. Thomas kept everything in the filing cabinet in the back room. I haven't gone through all of it." Caleb looked at her. "You want to go through it now?" She did not particularly want to go through Thomas's filing cabinet. She'd avoided the back room as much as she could for 11 years, keeping it functional and clean, but not spending time in it, not reading through Thomas's handwriting on the files, not sitting in his chair. There was a category of things she managed by not examining them directly, and the back room was one of them. "Yes," she said. "Come on." The filing cabinet was old steel, 4 drawers, organized in Thomas's precise and idiosyncratic way. Not alphabetical, not chronological, but by his own internal logic that had made perfect sense to him and required translation for everyone else. She knew the logic, mostly, had watched him file things enough times over 20 years to understand the system. The property documents were in the 3rd drawer, in a folder labeled simply Land, which was Thomas's way. She pulled it out, sat down at the desk, and started going through it. Caleb stood in the doorway rather than coming fully into the room. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. He was giving her the space without making a production of giving her the space. She found what she needed in about 20 minutes. A survey document from 1987 and a letter from the original county planning office that predated Thomas's purchase of the property. She read it twice, carefully. The logging track was formally closed in 1989, she said. There's a county letter right here confirming it. Whitaker's lawyers are either working from bad records or they know exactly what the records say and are betting I don't. Which is more likely? She put the paper down. The second one. Caleb's jaw shifted slightly. It was the closest thing to anger she'd seen from him. You need to get that document to a lawyer tomorrow. I know. I know someone in Lander. She's good. If you want, I can call her tonight. Margaret looked at him. How do you know a property lawyer in Lander? Something moved across his face. Brief. Not quite painful, but close. From before. She did some work for a guide company I was involved with. We stayed in touch. He paused. She's good, Margaret. She doesn't waste time, and she doesn't charge you for things that don't need doing. She held the county letter in her hand and thought about Thomas. about the way he'd kept this document for decades in a plain folder with a one-word label, the way he'd never talked about it because it had never needed to be talked about, the way he'd trusted that things recorded correctly stayed recorded. "Call her," she said. Mom. The call was made that evening. The lawyer, whose name was Francis Alcott, and who had a voice on the phone like someone who had long since stopped tolerating inefficiency, agreed to review the documents and said she'd have a preliminary assessment within the week. Caleb gave her the broad strokes of the situation, and when he described Grant Whitaker's pattern of behavior, she was quiet in a way that told Margaret, listening from across the kitchen table, that the name wasn't unfamiliar to her. After he hung up, Margaret poured more coffee and said, "She knows him." "She knows of him," Caleb said. "Different thing. Is it better or worse?" He thought about it. "Better, I think. She's not surprised, which means she already knows how he operates." Margaret wrapped her hands around the mug. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pushing against the kitchen window with a low, steady pressure. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it the way she'd learned to feel weather over years of paying attention to what her body told her. A certain heaviness in the air, a particular quality to the cold that meant it was going to get worse before morning. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "Why are you doing this?" She held his gaze. "I need you to tell me the actual answer, not the easy one." He was quiet long enough that she knew he was taking the question seriously. "Because I've been somewhere where I couldn't do anything," he said. "Where something happened, and I couldn't fix it, and I couldn't undo it, and I had to live with that. And then I came here, and I saw a situation where someone was getting ground down by something that wasn't right, and I could actually do something about it." He looked at his coffee. "It's not entirely noble. Part of it's selfish. Helping you makes me feel like myself again, the version of myself I recognized." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's honest," she said. "I told you I would be." She nodded slowly. The wind pushed at the window again. The kitchen was warm, the lamp throwing a yellowed circle over the table between them, and she thought about Thomas and his plain folder and his one-word labels, and how some things, if you filed them right, stayed exactly where you put them, intact, retrievable, waiting for the moment when you finally needed them. "All right," she said. "Then we fight him." Caleb looked up. "Yeah? We have the documents, we have a lawyer, and I know this land better than any man with a wool coat and a survey map ever will." She set down her mug. "So yes, we fight him." Something settled in Caleb's face, not relief exactly, but something close to it. The expression of a person who had been waiting to stand next to something solid and had finally found it. "Then let's figure out where to start," he said. And they did. Francis Alcott called back in 4 days, not 7. Margaret was in the barn when Caleb came to find her, phone in hand, telling her Francis wanted to speak with her directly. She pulled off her work gloves, took the phone, and stood in the barn doorway with the cold coming in off the yard and the horses shifting in their stalls behind her. Francis didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Mrs. Holloway, I've looked at your documents. The 1989 closure letter is valid and properly recorded. Whitaker's easement claim has no legal foundation." A pause. "However, I want you to understand something. The fact that he's filing it anyway tells me he's not expecting to win it in court. He's expecting the process to exhaust you. Legal challenges are expensive and slow, and he knows that." "So what's he actually after?" Margaret asked. "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out." Another pause, shorter. "I've seen his name before, connected to 3 other land acquisitions in the region over the past 6 years. Elderly landowners, all of them. 2 sold. 1 didn't. I'd like to talk to the one who didn't." Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching the snow blow across the yard in thin, dry sheets. "Do what you need to do," she said. "And Francis, whatever you find, I want to know all of it, not just the parts you think I can handle." "That's the only way I work," Francis said. She handed the phone back to Caleb. He'd been leaning against the barn wall, not pretending he wasn't listening, which she appreciated. She told him what Francis had said, and he listened with his arms crossed, and that stillness he had when he was thinking hard about something. "He's done this before," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "Apparently." "Then he's got a pattern. And if Francis can document the pattern, then it stops being one old woman being stubborn," Margaret said, "and starts being something else entirely." She pulled her gloves back on. "But that takes time. And in the meantime, he's going to keep pushing." She was right about that. Within the week, she got a formal letter from a law firm in Casper. Not the easement claim, something different. A notice of a proposed county road assessment that would reevaluate the access road serving the south end of the valley. If the assessment went through, the cost of maintaining the road infrastructure could be passed to adjacent landowners. The numbers in the letter were not small. She sat at the kitchen table with that letter for a long time after supper, the lamp making the numbers look no different than they were. The wood stove was going. Outside, the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the house creak and the windows frost over at the corners. She heard Caleb's boots on the porch steps and then his knock. He always knocked now, had figured out somewhere in the first few weeks that she needed the 2 seconds of warning, and she said, "Come in," without looking up. He sat down across from her, looked at the letter, looked at her face. "Another one?" he said. "Road assessment. It's probably another pressure tactic." She set the letter down. "Or it's real, and I can't afford it." "You can't know which yet." "No." She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. She was tired in a way that had been building for weeks, the specific exhaustion of fighting something that kept reshaping itself, kept finding new angles. "I'm starting to understand how he wins," she said. "Not by being stronger, just by having more resources to sustain the fight longer than anyone else." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Forward it to Francis. Tonight." "I will." "And Margaret." He waited until she looked up at him. "You're not sustaining this alone. You understand that?" She held his gaze. There was something she'd been managing carefully for weeks, a line she'd drawn in herself between accepting help with the work of the ranch and accepting something more than that, something less easy to categorize. She could feel that line under some pressure right now, and she wasn't entirely sure what she thought about it. "I know," she said, and left it there. The storm that Francis had warned her about, not a weather warning, a metaphorical one, brace for escalation, arrived in mid-January in the form of 2 things happening on the same day. The first was a visit from a county assessor Margaret had never seen before, a young man with a clipboard and nervous eyes who knocked on her door at 9 in the morning and said he was there to conduct a property evaluation. She asked him who had requested it. He checked his clipboard and said it had been flagged for routine assessment. She asked when the last routine assessment had been. He checked the clipboard again and couldn't find that information. She let him do his job because she didn't have the legal ground to stop him, but she followed him around every inch of the property and wrote down everything he wrote down. And when he left, she called Francis from the kitchen table before her coffee was even cold. The second thing was a piece in the local weekly newspaper, the kind of small circulation paper that everyone in the valley read because there wasn't anything else, that described, in vague but pointed terms, the uncertain future of several aging properties in the region and the economic opportunities that thoughtful development might bring to the area. It didn't name Margaret. It didn't need to. Anyone who read it and knew the valley would know exactly which properties were being discussed. She read it once, set it down, and didn't pick it up again. Caleb read it when he came in for coffee that afternoon. He read it the same way he read most things, carefully, without expression, front to back. When he finished, he put it on the table and said, "He has someone at the paper." "Or someone who owes him something," Margaret said, "which amounts to the same thing. Is there anything in here that's factually wrong?" She thought about it. "No, that's the part that's actually clever. It's all technically accurate. It's just framed to mean something it doesn't mean." Caleb looked at the paper for another moment. "You should respond." "In the paper?" "In the paper, in your own words, not through a lawyer, not through a statement. You." He looked at her. "People in this valley know you. They might not know they're being worked by Whitaker, but they know Margaret Holloway. Give them something to compare." She looked at him. "I'm not a writer." "You don't need to be." You just need to tell the truth in the same plain way you tell me things. She thought about it longer than she might have expected to. Part of her resistance was the same old instinct, the one that said you kept your private business private, that you didn't put yourself in front of people and ask them to look at you, that the way you showed what you were made of was by enduring quietly and letting the endurance speak. But that instinct had been built in a time when quiet endurance was enough. She was starting to understand it might not be anymore. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she wrote something short and factual and entirely without self-pity, describing the history of the Holloway property, the nature of the easement claim, and its documented invalidity, and her intention to remain on the land. She didn't mention Whitaker by name. She didn't need to. She dropped it off at the paper's office on a Thursday morning and didn't think about it again until it ran the following week. The response surprised her. Not in volume, it was a small valley with a small paper, but in tone. 3 people called the house phone. 2 stopped her in the feed store parking lot. Pete Gruber came by with a pie his wife had made, which was Pete's way of saying something he wasn't going to say with words. What they all communicated, in their various ways, was that they'd been waiting for her to say something, and now that she had, they felt less like bystanders. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, but she filed it away. The real storm, the weather one, not the metaphorical one, came in the last week of January. She'd been watching the forecast for days. The meteorologists on the radio were using words like historic and multi-day event and significant accumulation, which in Wyoming meant something different than it did in places where weather announcers used dramatic language about 4 inches of snow. When Wyoming forecasters said historic, they were usually right. Caleb had been staying later in the evenings all that week, helping her run through a checklist they'd developed together. Extra feed moved inside, generator tested and fueled, the section of barn roof they'd repaired in November checked again for weak points, the water lines insulated as thoroughly as they could manage, the truck filled with gas and parked where it wouldn't get boxed in by drifting. On the evening before the storm was set to arrive, they stood in the barn in the lamplight doing a final count of the horses and the livestock, making sure everything was as squared away as it could be. "You should stay," Margaret said. Caleb looked up from checking the water trough. "The cabin doesn't have the heating capacity for whatever this is going to be," she said, in the practical tone she used for practical statements. "There's a spare room. It's not much, but it's warm." He held her gaze for a moment in the way he had of looking at things, directly and without hurry, like he had enough respect for the situation to give it the time it deserved. "All right," he said. She went in and made up the spare room, which hadn't been used since a cousin of Thomas's had visited 7 years ago. The bedding smelled of cedar from the chest she kept it in. She opened the window crack for a minute to let the smell breathe, then closed it again because the cold outside was already building its pressure against the house. The storm hit at 2 in the morning. She knew the moment it arrived because she'd been sleeping lightly in the way she always did in severe weather, one ear cocked for the sound of something going wrong. And when the wind shifted from a consistent pressure to something more violent, gusting, directional, slapping at the north side of the house with what felt like actual intention, she was awake before her eyes were open. She dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen. The thermometer outside the window read -22. The snow was coming sideways. Caleb was already in the kitchen. He had the coffee on and was looking out the window at the yard where nothing was visible beyond about 10 feet of gray-white chaos. "How long's it been going?" she asked. "About 40 minutes. He handed her a mug. "We need to check the barn at first light. Not before. Visibility's too bad." She knew he was right, even though every instinct she had was pushing her toward the barn door. The animals were inside, secured and fed. Going out in zero visibility at 2 in the morning didn't help them. It just added the risk of her getting turned around and lost between the house and the barn, which was a real risk in this kind of whiteout, and not one she was too proud to acknowledge. "First light," she agreed. They sat at the kitchen table for what remained of the night. Not sleeping, not talking constantly, but not silent either. The kind of company that doesn't need to perform itself, that can exist in the same space with a storm howling outside and a lamp burning inside, and the occasional exchange of words when there were words worth saying. Around 4 in the morning, Caleb said, The roof over the east stall. We reinforced it, but the original structure was already under stress. I know. If the snow load gets heavy enough, I know, she said again. We go at first light. First light, such as it was, a gray-white brightening rather than anything resembling dawn, came at around 7. The wind had dropped slightly from its peak, but was still coming hard. They geared up in the mudroom, layering everything they had, and Margaret tied a rope to the porch post the way Thomas had taught her in her first winter here, running it across the yard toward the barn so you'd have something to hold on to if you lost your bearings. They went out together. The snow was at 3 feet and still coming. The path between the house and the barn, which in normal conditions was about 30 yards, felt like a different country entirely. The wind trying to push them sideways, the snow so thick and fine, it got into every gap in their layering and started working immediately on exposed skin. Margaret kept one hand on the rope and her head down, and when she looked up, she could see Caleb just ahead of her, moving steadily, not fast, but not stopping. The barn door had drifted over on the east side. Caleb got the shovel from under the porch and cleared it while she held the lamp. And then they were inside, and the relative stillness of the barn hit her like something physical. The warm animal smell of it, the sound of the horses moving, the sound that meant everything was still there and still standing. She went down the stalls first, checking each animal by hand, talking to them in the low, even voice she used that wasn't sweet exactly, but was steady, telling them the specific nothing you tell animals to let them know you're there and they're not alone. The horses were unsettled but not panicked. The cattle in the south end were restless. Everyone was accounted for. Then she looked up. The east roof section over stalls 4 and 5 was bowing. She could see it from where she stood, a visible depression in the line of the roof line, where the snow load was pressing down from outside and the old timber was giving by fractions of an inch. Caleb. He was already looking at it. How long? She said. He studied it. Hours, maybe. Not days. Can we shore it? With what we have here? Partially. He was already moving toward the back of the barn where they'd stored extra lumber from the November repairs. He pulled 2 lengths of 8x8 from the pile and was measuring the span with his eye. We can get a tent post under the worst point. It won't hold indefinitely, but it might hold long enough. They worked for an hour and a half in the cold of the barn, Caleb doing the heavy placement and Margaret doing the securing and the detail work her hands were better suited for. The temporary post went in under the worst depression in the roof. When Caleb let go of it and stepped back, the roof line didn't move further. That'll do for now, he said. His breath was coming in visible clouds. She could see by his face that his hands were cold. He'd taken his gloves off at one point to manage a bolt and hadn't quite gotten the circulation back. Come here, she said, and she took both his hands in hers and pressed them between her palms, the way you do. It was a practical gesture. She told herself it was a practical gesture. His hands were rough and cold, and she rubbed them until she felt the warmth start to return, and neither of them said anything. They went out twice more that day. The second time, around midday, they discovered a section of the pasture fence had collapsed under the snow. No animals lost because everything was in the barn, but a gap that would need addressing the moment the storm let up. The third time, in the late afternoon, they found the water line to the south trough had frozen despite the insulation, and spent 45 minutes with the heat tape and a portable heater working it back to functional. By evening, they were back at the kitchen table, both of them worn down in the bone-deep way that physical work and severe cold produces. A tiredness that isn't unpleasant exactly, that has a completeness to it because you've done what needed doing and nothing catastrophic has happened because you did it. Margaret made soup from what was in the pantry. It was not particularly good soup. She was an adequate cook and not a gifted one, but it was hot, and they ate it at the table while the storm continued outside. Grant Whitaker arrived the next morning. She saw the truck from the kitchen window. That distinctive truck, somehow pristine even in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, which told her he'd had someone drive it out and probably hadn't come himself until the main road was plowed enough to manage. He came in expensive cold weather gear and boots that were better than his last pair, but still not right for this kind of snow. He walked across her yard with the careful steps of a man who didn't fully trust the ground under him. She was on the porch before he reached it. Margaret. He looked at the property around him, the barn, the drifts, the clear evidence of recent emergency work, and his face arranged itself into something that was supposed to be sympathy. I heard it was bad up here. I wanted to check in personally. You came to check in, she said, and to tell you that my offer is still on the table, given what you've just been through. He spread his hands in a gesture that was meant to convey generosity. It would be a fair resolution to a difficult situation. She looked at him in the pale winter light, this man who had been working against her for 3 years by methods that were never quite illegal and never quite honest. And she felt something clarify inside her the way things sometimes did when you were too tired for pretense. Grant, she said, the roof held, the animals are safe. I have a lawyer who's very interested in the pattern of your acquisitions in this region, and I have documentation that your easement claim is baseless. And I have enough firewood, enough hay, and enough resolve to be standing on this porch long after you've found somewhere else to put your money. She held his gaze. The offer isn't going to find a different answer, no matter when you bring it. Something changed in his face. The sympathy dropped away entirely, and what was under it was what she'd always suspected was there. Not rage, nothing so human as rage. Just the cold recalculation of a man reassessing a situation that wasn't going the way he'd planned. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. You made it exactly as hard as it is, she said. I'm just making it clear. He stood there for another moment. Then he turned and walked back through the snow to his truck. Caleb appeared at the door behind her. She didn't turn around. He's not done, Caleb said. No, she agreed. But he's rattled. She watched the truck move carefully down her road, the tires working through the snow, the expensive machine looking somewhat less certain of itself than it had on arrival. Good, she said. She went back inside and poured herself more coffee and sat down at the table, and she felt the ranch around her the way she sometimes did on quiet mornings. The weight of it, the specific stubborn realness of it, everything Thomas had ever said about the honest nature of land compressed into the simple fact of still being here. Outside, the snow kept coming. She let it. Frances called 3 days after the storm broke. Margaret was outside assessing the fence damage in the south pasture when her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, and she pulled it out with fingers still stiff from the cold and answered before she'd fully registered who it was. I found the third landowner, Frances said without preamble. The one who didn't sell. Her name is Ruth Casper. She's 71, she runs a small cattle operation about 40 miles north of you, and she spent 2 years fighting off the same pattern you're dealing with. Easement claims, county assessments, newspaper pressure, the whole sequence. A brief pause. She won, but she also told me something I think you need to hear. Margaret stopped walking. The snow around her was knee-deep, and the sky above was that particular post-storm blue that looked painted on, too bright and too clean, like the weather was apologizing. Tell me. Whitaker wasn't just trying to buy her land. He had a mineral survey done on her property without her knowledge or consent, which is its own legal issue, and the survey showed a significant coal seam running under the south end of her parcel. Frances's voice was precise and level, the way it always was when she was delivering information she wanted to make sure landed correctly. The seam doesn't stop at her property line. It runs through. And based on the geography, I'd estimate there's a reasonable probability that the same seam, or a related one, runs under the southern portion of the Holloway property. The wind moved across the pasture. Margaret stood in the snow and felt the specific quality of silence that came when something you'd been circling finally showed you its center. He doesn't want the land, she said. He wants what's under it. The land is just the access, the logging track on the south end, which would give him equipment access to the seam from the adjacent parcel he already owns. Frances let that sit for a moment. Margaret, if this is accurate, and I believe it is, what he's been doing to you isn't just aggressive business practice. Filing a fraudulent easement claim and using coordinated county pressure to coerce a landowner is actionable. And if we can document that he's done this pattern to multiple landowners, we're looking at something considerably more serious. Margaret thought about Ruth Casper, 71 years old and 40 miles north, who had spent 2 years of her life fighting the same invisible machine. She thought about the other 2 landowners Frances had mentioned, the ones who had sold. She wondered what they'd walked away from without ever knowing what was underneath it. "What do you need from me?" she said. I need you to authorize a mineral survey of your own property, legitimate and documented. If we can confirm the seam, it changes everything. It gives you leverage you don't currently have, and it establishes the motive behind his actions. A pause. I also need you to be prepared for him to escalate when he realizes you're not going to break. He already knows I'm not going to break, Margaret said. He's known that since January. Then he'll try something else. Francis's voice didn't waver. Stay careful. Stay documented. Write down everything, every visit, every letter, every conversation you have with anyone connected to him, date and time. All right. And Margaret, call Ruth Casper. I think you should talk to each other. She called Ruth Casper that evening. The woman who answered had a voice like gravel and dry humor in equal measure. The voice of someone who had been through something difficult and had come out the other side without needing to perform the difficulty for anyone. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. Margaret stood at the kitchen window while the last of the day's light died over the ridge, and she listened to a woman describe, in calm and specific terms, almost exactly what Margaret had been living through, the same sequence, the same tactics, the same experience of something pressing against you from all directions at once while maintaining the legal appearance of ordinary business practice. The hardest part, Ruth said at one point, wasn't the legal stuff. Frances is good. She'll handle that. The hardest part was the doubt, the way it gets inside your head. You start asking yourself whether you're being paranoid, whether this is just commerce and you're the difficult one, whether the sensible thing really is to just take the money and go. Yes, Margaret said. I know that part. What kept me going was getting angry enough. Ruth's voice was matter-of-fact about it. Not scared angry or self-righteous angry, just clear angry. The kind where you see exactly what's happening and you decide you're not going to pretend you don't see it anymore. Margaret thought about standing on her porch in the aftermath of the storm, watching Whitaker's truck navigate down her snow-covered road. The thing she'd felt then hadn't been triumph exactly. It had been closer to what Ruth was describing. A clarification. A settling. You still have your property? Margaret asked. Still have it. Still running cattle. And Whitaker moved on to somewhere else, which is the part that still burns me, honestly, that he just found the next one. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Maybe that's different now. If Frances is building a case that covers multiple properties, maybe the next landowner doesn't have to go through what we went through. After she hung up, Margaret sat at the table for a while in the dark, not turning on the lamp, just sitting with the shapes the darkness made of the familiar kitchen, Thomas's mugs on their hooks, the filing cabinet in the back room with its plain folders and one-word labels, the photograph on the shelf she'd stopped seeing because she saw it every day. She thought about what Ruth had said about clear anger, about deciding not to pretend you don't see what you're seeing. She'd been doing that her whole life, in one way or another, seeing things plainly and acting accordingly. She hadn't always called it courage because she'd never thought of it that way. It was just the way you had to be if you were going to survive anything. But sitting here in the dark, in the house Thomas had loved and the land that had outlasted both her grief and Whitaker's schemes and 12, 11 years of winters, she thought that maybe what she'd always called stubbornness had another name that she'd just never been comfortable using. She turned on the lamp and went to find Caleb. He was in the barn doing the evening check, moving through the stalls with the same methodical calm he brought to everything. She stood in the doorway and told him about Frances's call, about the mineral survey, about Ruth Casper and the coal seam, and the real shape of what Whitaker had been doing. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him. The fact that he didn't fill space with reactions while you were still talking didn't need to demonstrate that he was engaged by inserting himself into your sentences. He just listened until you were done. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, one hand resting on the stall gate, looking at the middle distance. He's been planning this for years, Caleb said. Not just with you, across the whole region. That's what it looks like. And the people who sold, they never knew what they were giving up. No. He turned to look at her. His expression wasn't angry, not exactly. It was something harder to name than anger, something that lived underneath anger, the foundation it was built on. We need to make sure this doesn't just stop at your property line. Frances is already thinking that way. Good. He straightened up. The mineral survey. How long will that take? She said a few weeks to schedule, then a few more to get results. It's not fast. Does Whitaker know Francis is involved? He will soon, if he doesn't already. She leaned against the barn door frame. Francis doesn't hide. She said that's intentional. She wants him to know someone's paying attention, because people like him depend on no one paying attention. Caleb nodded slowly. He's going to make a move before the survey results come back. Try to force something. Probably. Then we need to be ready for that. He looked at her. Are you ready for that? She thought about the question seriously, the way he'd asked it, not as a pep talk, not as a challenge, just as a genuine inquiry. Was she ready? Yes, she said. I've been ready. I just didn't always know what I was getting ready for. Oats. February moved differently than January had. The storms kept coming, 2 more significant ones, one that dropped another 18 inches and one that was mostly ice, which was in many ways worse. But there was a shift in the character of the days that Margaret couldn't entirely account for. Something had changed in her understanding of the fight she was in, and that change had loosened something she hadn't known was tight. She started sleeping better. Not perfectly. She was still waking at 2 or 3 in the morning sometimes, still doing the mental inventory of what needed doing, still listening to the house sounds and wind with that particular alertness that never fully left. But the quality of the sleep she got had improved, and she noticed it in the mornings, in the way the first half hour of the day felt less like bracing for impact. She also noticed, with the somewhat reluctant clarity that she'd learned to pay attention to, that a significant portion of the change had to do with Caleb. Not in a way she was ready to examine out loud. She wasn't built for that kind of examination, had never been comfortable with feelings that didn't have a clear practical application, had always found it easier to love people through the things she did for them than through anything she said. Thomas had understood that about her. He'd been the same way, more or less. They'd been 2 people who showed up for each other day after day without making speeches about it, and she'd thought that was just what a good marriage looked like. But there was something happening now that was different from any category she had an existing name for. It wasn't the same as what she'd had with Thomas. She wasn't interested in pretending it was, and she wasn't interested in replacing something irreplaceable. It was its own thing, smaller in some ways and stranger in others, and she'd decided the most honest thing she could do with it was to let it be what it was without trying to force it into a shape she recognized. What she knew was that she looked for him in the yard in the mornings, that his presence on the property had become part of the texture of her days in a way that would leave a gap if it were removed. That when something difficult happened, a piece of bad news, a hard day, a moment when the weight of everything pressed down harder than usual, her first instinct was to find him, not to call Francis or write in the notebook she kept on the nightstand or go to the back room and sit with Thomas's things. That was something. She wasn't sure yet what. What? The town, which had been murmuring about Margaret and Caleb since December, had moved by February into something more like resigned acceptance, with a few outliers still generating opinions. Darlene Marsh, who Margaret had decided she would go ahead and consider a friend despite everything, told her in the feed store one afternoon that the general consensus had shifted. People have stopped saying he's taking advantage of you, Darlene said, bagging grain with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done the same motion 10,000 times. Now they're saying you're good for each other, which is almost more irritating. Why is it irritating? Margaret said. Because it means they've decided they understand the situation. And whenever people decide they understand something, they stop paying attention and start editorializing. Darlene handed over the bags. Enjoy it while you can. By spring, they'll have you married and the ranch turned into something profitable, and everyone will want credit for seeing it coming. That's a lot of projection for a Tuesday, Darlene smiled. A real one, the kind she didn't give out frequently. How are you actually doing? Margaret considered the question in the way she considered things she wasn't going to answer carelessly. Better than I was, she said, which is more than I expected to be saying in February. The letter from Whitaker's lawyers arrived on a Wednesday, and it was different from the others. The previous correspondence had been procedural, filings, notices, the formal language of legal maneuvering. This one was addressed to Margaret personally, from Whitaker himself, not his lawyers, and its tone was different. Not softer exactly, but more direct. As if he'd decided that the performance of civility was no longer worth the effort. He wrote that he was prepared to significantly increase his offer. He wrote that the property would become increasingly difficult to maintain as time passed. He wrote, and this was the part that made her set the letter down and look at the window for a full minute before picking it up again, that he was concerned for her well-being and that he hoped she had people in her life she could trust to give her objective advice, not just tell her what she wanted to hear. She brought it to Caleb. He read it standing at the kitchen counter, and she watched the shift in his expression, the way his jaw set and then released deliberately, the way he put the letter down with more care than it deserved. "He's trying to plant a seed," Caleb said. "About me?" "Yes." "Suggesting that I'm influencing you, that you're not making clear decisions?" "Yes." She watched him. "Does that bother you?" He looked at her. "It bothers me that he's doing it to you. What it's doing to me is less interesting." He paused. "You know he's wrong." "Of course I know he's wrong. That's not why I'm showing it to you." "Then why?" She folded the letter and set it on the table. "Because you should know what he's saying, because things like this have a way of sitting between people if they don't get looked at directly." She met his gaze. "I'm not someone who lets things fester. You should know that about me." He held her gaze for a moment, and something passed through his face that she couldn't entirely read. Not quite emotion, but the near vicinity of it, the place just before where emotion becomes visible. "I know that about you," he said. "Good." She picked up the letter. "I'll forward this to Francis." "Forward it to Francis," he agreed. Francis's response came quickly, and with a particular quality of controlled energy that Margaret had come to associate with the lawyer's moments of genuine satisfaction. "He wrote to you directly because he's nervous," Francis said. "Nervous people make mistakes. I want you to document that letter carefully, that date received, condition of the envelope, everything. Because the language he used about outside influence and objective advice, combined with the pattern we're building, starts to paint a picture of a campaign to isolate and coerce." A brief pause. "Also, I've heard back from the mineral survey company. They can come out in 3 weeks. That's faster than you said. I called in a favor." Francis's voice had something almost dry in it. "I've also been in contact with the county assessor's office about the assessment process that was initiated on your property. They are being somewhat cagey, which is itself informative." "What does cagey tell you?" "It tells me someone made a call they'd rather not be asked about, which means there's a paper trail they'd rather not have surfaced." Another pause. "I want to depose the young assessor who came to your property. I need you to give me everything you wrote down about that visit." Margaret went to the notebook she'd been keeping since Francis first told her to document everything. 47 days of dates, times, names, verbatim descriptions of conversations. She read out the entry about the assessor, the exact time of his arrival, his name from the badge he'd been wearing, what he'd written on the clipboard as best as she'd been able to see, what he'd said when she asked who requested the assessment. Francis was quiet on the other end, and Margaret could hear the sound of notes being taken. "Good," Francis said when she finished. "This is very good. You've kept this better than most people do." "I had a husband who believed in writing things down," Margaret said. "Yeah." The mineral survey team came on a cold, clear morning in the second week of March. 4 people with equipment she didn't know the names of, professional and efficient, and not particularly communicative. They were on her property for 2 full days, working the south end primarily, the area above where Francis had calculated the coal seam might run. Margaret watched them from a distance, mostly. Caleb watched with her, standing at the fence line in the thin March sun that was warm enough to feel, but not warm enough to do anything about the snow still on the ground. "Strange feeling," she said. "People measuring what's under your own land." "You should know what's there," Caleb said. "Whatever it is, it's yours." "I never thought about it that way before. What's underneath?" He looked at her sideways. "Thomas never mentioned it?" Thomas was interested in what was on the surface, the grass, the water, the timber, what the land could support. She watched one of the survey teams set up equipment near the old fence line by the logging track. He wasn't a man who spent much time looking for hidden things. You think he knew? She considered that. I think he knew the land was worth more than people gave it credit for. He said once that land was the only honest thing he'd ever owned. She paused. I always thought he meant it was straightforward. What you saw was what you got. Maybe he meant something more complicated than that. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Or maybe what you see is what you get, and what you get is more than most people bother to look for. She glanced at him. He was still watching the survey team, his profile against the cold blue sky, and she had the passing thought, not for the first time, but perhaps more clearly than before, that this man had come into her life in the specific shape of the gap that had been there, which was either a remarkable coincidence or simply what happened when you finally stopped blocking the door. She didn't say any of that. She wasn't built for saying things like that. But she filed it. Immersive. The survey results came back 12 days later, and Frances called on a Thursday afternoon with the kind of composure in her voice that Margaret had learned meant she was holding something significant steady. There's a coal seam, Frances said. Significant. It runs under your south parcel, approximately where we expected. Your property sits directly above the most accessible extraction point from the adjacent land Whitaker already owns. A breath. Margaret, what he's been trying to take from you is worth considerably more than anything he ever offered you. The kitchen was warm. The afternoon light was coming through the west window at the angle it only reached in mid-March, when the sun had climbed enough to clear the ridgeline. Margaret sat at the kitchen table where she'd sat through the worst nights of the winter and looked at the light on the floor and didn't say anything for a moment. What happens now? She said. Now we file a complaint with the State Attorney General's office documenting the pattern of conduct across multiple properties. I've spoken with Ruth Casper's attorney and we're coordinating. The fraudulent easement claim, the coordinated county pressure, the undisclosed mineral survey on Ruth's property. Taken together, this is not a civil matter anymore. This is potentially criminal. Frances paused. He was betting that no one would connect the pieces. He was betting on isolation. He bet wrong, Margaret said. Yes, Frances said. He did. After she hung up, Margaret sat for a few more minutes in the afternoon light. Then she got up and went to the door and called Caleb's name across the yard. He looked up from the fence he was mending along the near pasture. A man in a worn jacket with mud on his boots and the last of the winter's work still on his hands, and she thought, watching him come toward her across her land, that there was something she'd been meaning to say for a while now, and had been putting off in the way she put off things she wasn't sure she had the words for. When he got close enough, she said, Frances has the coal seam confirmed. She's filing with the AG's office. It's over, or close enough to over, that the rest is just paperwork. He stopped a few feet from her, and she watched the weight of it register in his face. Not surprised, because they'd both known this was where it was heading, but the particular quality of relief that comes when a thing you've been carrying for a long time is finally set down. That's good news, he said. Yes. She held his gaze. It's also partly because you were here. I want to say that out loud so you don't have to wonder whether I know it. Something shifted in his face, something quiet and real that had nothing performative about it. You would have found it without me. Maybe, she said, but I don't know that. And I'm not interested in pretending. She turned and went back inside. After a moment, she heard his boots on the porch steps behind her, and the door, and the familiar sound of him coming into her kitchen, and she put the kettle on and they sat down together while the spring light moved across the floor, and the ridge outside the window held its old ground, patient and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in its shadow, which was perhaps what land was for. The paperwork, as it turned out, was not just paperwork. Frances had used that word to make the end of the fight sound manageable, and Margaret had appreciated the intention behind it. But the months that followed the AG's office filing were their own kind of winter, less brutal than January had been, but long in the particular way that legal proceedings were long, grinding forward in increments too small to feel like movement until suddenly you looked back and saw how far you'd come. The Attorney General's investigation opened formally in April. By May, 2 of Whitaker's former business associates had agreed to provide statements. The assessor who had come to Margaret's property in January, the nervous young man with the clipboard, turned out to be the thread that unraveled the most. Frances had been right about the paper trail. He'd received a call from someone in Whitaker's organization before the assessment was scheduled, and he'd documented it, apparently out of some combination of legal caution and conscience. And that document had been sitting in a county file for 4 months, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Margaret learned all of this in pieces through Frances's calls and the occasional letter, and she received each piece the same way she received most news, steadily, without theatrics, adding it to the shape of things and adjusting accordingly. What she hadn't expected was Ruth Casper. Ruth drove down from her property in early April, a 4-hour trip each way, to have lunch with Margaret. She arrived in a truck older than Caleb's and parked it with the particular decisiveness of someone who had been parking trucks in difficult conditions for 50 years. She was a small woman, Ruth. Margaret had expected someone larger, somehow, based on the voice. With gray hair cut short and hands that told the same story Margaret's did, the story of work sustained over decades. They sat at Margaret's kitchen table and ate the soup Margaret had made, better than the February batch she'd been practicing. And they talked about Whitaker and Frances and coal seams and county assessors, and then they talked about other things, the texture of their respective ranches, the specific challenges of the North Wyoming winter, the way a cattle operation required a different relationship with time than almost any other kind of work. At one point, Ruth looked around the kitchen, at the mugs on the hooks, the photograph on the shelf, the worn floor, and said, "You've been here a long time." 23 years? It shows. Ruth said it as a compliment. Some places look lived in and some places look inhabited. This is inhabited. Margaret looked around her own kitchen, trying to see it the way a stranger would. My husband built most of it. And you kept it. I kept it. Ruth wrapped her hands around her mug. The same gesture Margaret made, the same gesture Caleb made, a gesture Margaret had decided was simply what people did with warmth when they needed it. That's not a small thing, Ruth said. People don't understand that. Keeping something is its own kind of building. Caleb came in from the yard around 1 o'clock, muddy and honest-looking, and Margaret introduced them, and Ruth looked at him for a moment with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had been reading people for 7 decades. "You're the one who stayed through the winter," Ruth said. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She looked at Margaret. "Good," she said again, as if she were confirming something to herself. She drove back north in the mid-afternoon, and Margaret stood on the porch watching the old truck until it disappeared around the bend in the county road, and she felt something she didn't have an immediate name for. A warmth that wasn't entirely about Ruth herself, but about what Ruth represented, the existence of another woman who had stood in the same storm and was still standing. The formal resolution came in June. Grant Whitaker did not go to trial, which Frances had said was the likely outcome. Men like him, with enough money and enough lawyers, rarely did. What he did instead was settle, and the terms of the settlement were more than Margaret had dared to expect in January, when she'd been sitting at her kitchen table in the dark, trying to figure out if she could afford to keep fighting. The easement claim was formally withdrawn, and the county records were corrected. The fraudulent assessment was voided. Whitaker agreed to a consent decree with the Attorney General's office that prohibited the specific pattern of conduct he'd been running, required him to pay restitution to the 2 landowners who had sold under duress, an amount that wouldn't restore what they'd lost but acknowledged what had been taken, and subjected his future business dealings in the state to oversight for 5 years. Frances called to tell her, and her voice had that quality it got when she'd done something she considered worth doing. "It's not everything," Frances said. "It won't be everything. But it's real." "It's real," Margaret agreed. "The 2 sellers, the Hendersons and old Jim Pratt, they'll get some money back. Not enough, but some." Margaret thought about Jim Pratt, whom she didn't know personally, but whose name she'd seen on the adjacent property records she'd gone through with Frances in December. He'd sold in the 2nd year of Whitaker's campaign. She wondered what he'd done with the money, whether he'd bought another place or whether he'd just stopped, whether the selling had been the end of something that couldn't be rebuilt. "How's Ruth?" she asked. "Ruth is Ruth," Frances said, and Margaret could hear the smile in it. "She wanted me to tell you she's going to breed the South herd this year. She'd been holding off." "That's good news." "Yes." A brief pause. "Margaret, you should know. This case, the documentation you kept, the way you refused to be isolated, it's what made the pattern visible. Without your property in the picture, we couldn't have connected the other acquisitions. Ruth's fight was real, but it was contained. Yours opened it up." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't trying to open anything up. I was just trying to keep my land." "That's usually how it works," Francis said. "People fighting for their own thing end up fighting for more than that, not because they're heroic, just because they refuse to disappear." The summer that followed was the best one Margaret could remember in years, which she recognized was partly circumstantial. The legal weight lifted, the threat of Whitaker gone, but was also genuinely materially better in ways that had nothing to do with circumstance. Pete Gruber came by in July to help rerun the fence line along the south pasture, a full day's work that he did with characteristic lack of ceremony, showing up with his truck and his tools and his one-word acknowledgement of why he was there, which was no acknowledgement at all. He just worked. Margaret worked beside him, and they didn't talk much because they didn't need to, and at the end of the day she put a plate of food in front of him and he ate it and said it was all right, which from Pete was fairly close to a standing ovation. Darlene Marsh organized, without being asked and without consulting Margaret, a work party in August that arrived on a Saturday morning in the form of 7 people with tools and trucks and a covered dish each, the Wyoming equivalent of a parade. They repaired the section of barn the winter had damaged most severely, replaced the water line that had been giving problems since January, and built out a new storage room on the east side of the barn that Margaret had wanted for 3 years and never had the time or the extra hands to tackle. She stood in the middle of her yard that Saturday and watched people move around her property with the specific competence of people who knew how to work, and she felt something shift in her chest that she recognized after a moment as the unfamiliar sensation of being visible in a way that wasn't painful. She'd spent so long being invisible to these people. Not maliciously, not entirely, but in the way that people became invisible when they stopped requiring anything, when they managed their own problems without ever surfacing them. She'd thought that was how you maintained dignity. She understood now that it was also how you ended up alone. An older woman named Clara, who ran the post office and whom Margaret had exchanged maybe 40 words with in 20 years, handed her a cup of coffee from the thermos she'd brought and said, "We should have done this a long time ago." Margaret looked at her. "Yes," she said, "you should have." Clara absorbed that without offense, which was the right response. "Well," she said, "we're here now." Margaret took the coffee. "You're here now," she said, and let it be enough. It was Caleb who brought up the future first. They were sitting on the porch in the September evening, the air finally having made the turn from summer to something cooler, the light on the ridge doing the amber and orange thing that Margaret had watched from this porch for 23 years and still hadn't gotten tired of. She had a cup of coffee, he had water. They'd been sitting without talking for about 20 minutes, which was comfortable in the way that silences between people who knew each other well were comfortable. "I've been thinking about staying," Caleb said. She didn't say anything because she was thinking about how to answer it correctly. "Not just through the winter," he said. "Past that." "I know what staying means," she said. "I figured." He looked at the ridge. "I'm not asking for anything specific. I just wanted to say it out loud so it wasn't a thing we were both aware of and neither of us was saying." She recognized that, the instinct toward plainness, toward getting things into the open where they could be dealt with. It was a version of the same instinct she'd had with the letter Whitaker sent about outside influence, the same reason she'd shown it to Caleb rather than filing it away and hoping the implication didn't fester. "What would staying look like to you?" she said. He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than producing an answer that had been prepared in advance. Working the place, being useful, figuring out what the coal rights mean for the property's future, there are options there that aren't just about selling access. He paused. "Being here." "Being here," she repeated. "Yeah." She looked at her coffee. She thought about Thomas, the way she always thought about Thomas when something significant was happening. Not as a comparison, not as a standard to measure against, but as a presence she carried that had its own weight and texture and was hers to manage. She thought he would have liked Caleb, not for the obvious reasons, the competence, the honesty, but because Thomas had respected people who understood that land required a relationship, not just management, who treated the work as something owed to the place, not the other way around. She didn't know if Thomas would have wanted her to be happy exactly. He hadn't been a sentimental man, but she thought he would have wanted her to be present, to be actually living in the life she had, rather than maintaining the life she'd already had. "You should probably fix the northwest corner fence before it gets cold," she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then, "Yeah? And the storage room door hangs wrong. It's going to be a problem come January, when it freezes." "I can fix the door." "I know you can." She finally looked at him. "I'm not saying all the things you said. You understand that's not how I do things." "I understand that. But I'm also not saying you should leave." She held his gaze in the fading light, which is, for me, the same thing. He looked at her for a moment with that steadiness she'd come to rely on, the quality of attention he gave things that told you they mattered to him. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat for a while longer. The light on the ridge went from orange to the deep blue-gray that came just before dark, and the first stars showed up over the eastern edge of the valley, and somewhere in the lower pasture one of the horses made a sound, and the creak was audible. If you listened, and the whole property settled into the specific quiet that Margaret had been the only person to hear for 11 years, and which now, without ceremony or announcement, had become something else. In October, Frances sent a letter, an actual letter, not an email, which Margaret had come to understand was Frances's way of marking things she considered worth marking. It summarized the final disposition of the Whitaker matter, confirmed the corrected county records, and noted that the Cole Wright survey had been formally registered in Margaret's name, which meant that any future negotiation over mineral access would begin from a position of documented ownership rather than ignorance. At the bottom, in handwriting rather than type, Frances had added, "You kept better records than most law firms I know. Thomas trained you well." Margaret read that line twice. She hadn't told Frances much about Thomas, but she'd mentioned the filing cabinet, the plain folders, the one-word labels. Frances had understood what that meant about the person who'd built the system and the person who'd maintained it. She set the letter on the table and didn't put it away for a few days. She just let it sit there, where she could see it. The first real snow of the new season came in November, which was earlier than the previous year but lighter. 4 inches on the level, nothing the horses couldn't handle, nothing that required emergency measures. Margaret was up at 5:30 out of habit and stood at the kitchen window with her coffee watching the yard go from gray to white in the early light. She heard Caleb moving in the spare room, the sound of boots, the sound of him navigating the hallway he'd learned in the dark over months of early mornings. The spare room had become, without a formal conversation about it, his room, his few belongings in it, his jacket on the hook by the door, his name in the position of the second person in a house that had not had a second person in it for a very long time. He came into the kitchen and looked out the window beside her. 4 inches, he said. Maybe 5 on the ridge. Animals will want extra this morning. I know. She handed him the second mug she'd already poured without thinking about it, without it being a decision. He took it, wrapped both hands around it, looked out at the snow. "Where were you?" she said. 20 years ago? He glanced at her. It wasn't a serious question, or wasn't only serious. There was something in her voice she couldn't entirely suppress, a lightness that had been returning by degrees since the spring. He understood the tone. 20 years ago, he said, considering it. Probably making mistakes somewhere that seemed important at the time. She made a sound that was closer to a laugh than she'd intended. A real one, unguarded, the kind that surprised her when it came out, the kind she'd almost forgotten she was capable of. "Fair enough," she said. They stood there for another minute in the kitchen with the snow coming down outside and the coffee warm in their hands and the ranch around them, all 412 acres of it, holding its ground the way it always had, patient, unbeautiful, in the way that real things were unbeautiful, marked by every hard season it had ever survived, and entirely, stubbornly, present. The thing about a life, Margaret had decided somewhere in the long middle of this past year, was that it didn't announce its own turning points. You didn't feel the moment when endurance became something else, when surviving shaded into actually living. You just kept doing the work in front of you, day after day, and then one morning you stood at your own kitchen window with snow coming down and coffee in your hand and another person standing next to you, and you realized that the chapter you'd thought was behind you had been the beginning of something else entirely. Not because everything had worked out cleanly. It hadn't. The legal battle had cost money she hadn't fully recovered. The winter had left damage that wasn't all repaired. She was 59 years old and her shoulders still ached, and she still woke up sometimes in the early hours listening for sounds that meant something was wrong. But she was here. The land was hers, documented and defended and understood in ways it hadn't been before. The people who had walked past her for years had started stopping. And the man standing next to her had come from somewhere difficult and found, in the specific difficulty of this place and this work and this woman, something he recognized as worth staying for. That wasn't a happy ending in the way stories described happy endings, tied off and resolved and complete. It was something less tidy and more durable than that. It was two people with histories and damage and the particular stubbornness of people who had survived enough winters, standing together in a kitchen on a November morning, watching the snow, neither of them requiring the moment to be more than what it was. The snow kept falling. The ranch kept holding. And Margaret Holloway, who had been told in one way or another for years that her time had passed, looked out at her land and knew with the specific certainty of someone who had earned the right to know it, that it hadn't. It hadn't even come close.